Good evening. Tonight I'll be discussing the workability and disadvantages of what the affirmative is claiming, that removing affirmative or race-based affirmative action would be more beneficial. The opponent recently brought up a story about an Indian student posing as an African American to get into med school. He emphasized the fact that he was a mediocre student and that he was replacing someone who was maybe more qualified. However, I'd like to bring up that originally affirmative action or race-based affirmative action was designed to encourage initiatives and the use of non-traditional means that will identify and place those individuals who have the qualifications to succeed. So it's not just allowing mediocre students to have the chance, it's giving people who don't have the background maybe or the advantages and same opportunities. According to Mitchell W. Perlman and Gregory Daniels. According to them, it also recognizes that diversity is generally an asset to a group in fulfilling its function and therefore ought to be considered in looking at qualifications for entry into that group. Additionally, many underprivileged individuals gain the chance to prove themselves through race-based affirmative action. For example, as you probably all know, Sonia Sotomayor is one of the 3 female Hispanics who has served on the Supreme Court, and she was actually a beneficiary of affirmative action, and she entered school. When she went to school, she received a C on her first midterm paper, but because of affirmative action, she was able to gain the opportunity to prove herself. And therefore, now we all know that she's a successful woman, one of the only 3 who has served on the Supreme Court. Therefore, affirmative action is allowing people who might not have the same opportunities educationally to get the chance to prove themselves. Additionally, another person who benefited from affirmative action attended Berkeley. This is from Russ, who spoke on NPR on the topic affirmative action is still necessary. He was on the bottom of the totem pole as an African American. However, affirmative action gave him, the individual, the necessary opportunity to prove that he was qualified. Therefore, race-based affirmative action is not replacing the spots of less qualified of qualified individuals with less qualified. It's merely giving the opportunity to those who have not had the chance to qualify to prove themselves. Another point that the affirmative stated was that in states where affirmative action was banned, or race-based affirmative action was banned, the diversity levels were maintained or increased. However, I have quite a few instances where that was not true. For example, according to Chang Y. Chung and Thomas J. Espenshade from Princeton University, the amount of African American applicants would fall from 42 to 13% if the race of applicants were ignored, while the proportion of white applicants admitted would only increase from 25 to 26.5%. So it would only be a 1.5 increase in white students, but there would be a drastic difference of over half if the race was not considered. In California specifically, since that's one of the main states we know has banned affirmative action, according to Brenda Bosch Suzanne Holtman in Affirmative Action Overview in the article she wrote for National Conference of State Legislators, statistics show that after California abolished its affirmative action programs in 1998, the minority student admissions at UC Berkeley fell 61%. Minority admissions at UCLA fell 36%. Therefore, these instances show that by removing race-based affirmative action, the diversity rates of minorities is actually not maintained or increased. And another side effect of removing race-based affirmative action, according to Chang Y. Chung and Thomas J. Espenshade of Princeton University, eliminating racial and ethnic preferences, for example, could actually discourage applications from members of minority student groups. This will therefore create a chain effect where not as many minority students are applying, and as they know, like when they're touring college campuses or looking at the diversity rates, they would notice that there's less of their group and they would not want to apply to these higher institutions of education because there's less people of their background there. And elaborating more on that point, according to Dana Goldstein, a writer for the New York Times, in an article When Affirmative Action Isn't Enough, she stated that in California, elite institutions have actually struggled to recruit Black and Hispanic students since the 1996 ballot referendum outlawed the use of affirmative action in public college admissions. Therefore, despite the statistics that maybe show that California is keeping the same diversity rates, they're actually struggling to maintain their diversity rates because of the ban on affirmative action. How much time? I would like to point out that One of the reasons why maybe the affirmative is stating that it's not working is because it got derailed pretty early. I believe they mentioned this, but the issue is that, sorry. Anyways, the affirmative was stating that they should maybe focus on low-income families as a point of accepting students in the admission process. However, that's the issue because a lot of low-income families, low-income families live in 7% of poor whites live in high poverty neighborhoods, while 23% of poor blacks do. But however, they're not differentiating, so that could still be a backfire against maintaining the diversity. Another issue I would like to point out is that by focusing on only low-income students, they're taking out the middle-class students of African Americans who might not also get the chance to prove themselves in colleges. By only focusing on low income, they're taking out those middle-class students who might not have the same amount of opportunities to prove themselves, and therefore that would be removing, that would be decreasing the diversity of college campuses as well.